Julian Kendrick stood at the checkpoint gate of Hadley County Regional Airfield in rural Georgia, dressed in civilian clothes for a classified assignment. He handed his federal flight authorization pass to Deputy Brett Lockhart. Lockhart studied the laminated card, looked Julian up and down, and without a single word, tore it in half. The two pieces fell to the asphalt. Julian opened his mouth. Before a sound left his lips, Lockhart's shoulder radio crackled with the transmission from Air Force Special Operations Command requesting Officer Lockhart by name. 3 hours before those two halves of laminated cardstock hit the ground, Julian Kendrick had been sitting in a briefing room at Moody Air Force Base, 40 miles east of Hadley County. The room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. Brigadier General Raymond Langford stood at the front, his voice low and deliberate, laying out the parameters of a classified emergency extraction drill that would take place at Hadley County Regional Airfield before sundown. Julian was the designated operational lead. He had been handpicked because he was one of the most decorated combat rescue helicopter pilots in Air Force Special Operations Command, a lieutenant colonel at 36 years old, a rank most officers did not touch until their mid-40s. The directive was precise. Julian was to drive to the airfield in a personal vehicle, arrive in civilian attire to simulate a low-profile field approach, present his federal flight authorization pass at the gate, and proceed directly to the tarmac, where 27 military personnel, 4 helicopters, and a mobile command unit were already staging. The civilian clothing detail was not optional. It was written into the operational protocol because the drill was designed to test response procedures under conditions where military presence was deliberately minimized. Julian did not question the order. He had spent 18 years following orders, and every single one of them had been earned through discipline, precision, and a willingness to fly into situations that would make most people refuse to leave the ground. He changed into jeans, a plain gray pullover, and brown boots. He placed his federal flight authorization pass in his front pocket and drove west on Route 17 toward Hadley County. The drive took just under an hour. The road cut through stretches of farmland and pine forest, and as Julian passed the county line, the landscape shifted into something quieter, older, more isolated. Hadley County was the kind of place where everybody recognized everybody, and a face that did not belong got noticed before a car door even closed. Julian pulled into the airfield entrance at 4:12 in the afternoon. The facility was small, a single runway operation mostly used for private charters and agricultural aviation. A chain-link gate separated the access road from the tarmac area, and a patrol car was parked diagonally across the entrance with its lights off. Deputy Brett Lockhart stood beside the driver's side door, with his arms crossed, a pair of mirrored sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead. His partner, a younger deputy named Cody Dempsey, leaned against the hood of the cruiser a few feet behind him, scrolling through his phone. Julian stepped out of his truck and walked toward the gate. He nodded at Lockhart and reached into his pocket for the pass. The moment Lockhart saw Julian's face, something changed. It was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the jaw. A slight shift in posture, the kind of repositioning that said, "I am now in control of whatever happens next." Lockhart took the pass and held it between 2 fingers like it was something unclean. He turned it over slowly, studying both sides with exaggerated care. Then the question started. "Where do you live? What are you doing out here? Who sent you? Where did you get this document? Have you ever been to this airfield before? Is this your vehicle?" Julian answered each one with the kind of measured calm that comes from years of military discipline. His voice was steady. His hands stayed visible at his sides. He gave his full name, his rank, his duty station, and the purpose of his visit. Lockhart listened to none of it. He looked past Julian at the truck, then back at the pass, then at Julian's clothes. You expect me to believe a man dressed like you has federal flight clearance, Lockhart said. His tone was not a question, it was an accusation. Julian told him the civilian attire was part of the operational protocol, and that if Lockhart contacted the base, they would confirm his identity within minutes. Lockhart did not reach for his radio. Instead, he looked at Dempsey, who had stopped scrolling and was watching the exchange with visible discomfort, and then he turned back to Julian. This pass is fake, Lockhart said. I have seen real ones, and this is not it. Julian started to respond. Lockhart did not let him finish. He gripped the laminated card with both hands and tore it down the center. The sound it made was small and sharp, like a branch snapping. The two pieces tumbled through the humid Georgia air and landed face up on the asphalt between them. Julian stared at the torn halves. 18 years of service, thousands of flight hours missions in 3 different combat theaters, and the document that verified his authority to access a runway in his own country had just been ripped apart by a man who never once asked him to verify a single fact. Julian opened his mouth to speak. And that is when Lockhart's shoulder radio erupted. The voice on the other end identified the transmission as originating from Air Force Special Operations Command. An aide to Brigadier General Raymond Langford asked if Lieutenant Colonel Julian Kendrick had arrived at the airfield. The question was direct. The tone was urgent. For 2 full seconds, Lockhart did not move. His eyes darted to the pieces of the pass on the ground, then to Julian, then to the radio on his shoulder. Dempsey took a step forward. Lockhart picked up the radio and pressed the transmit button. No one by that name has come through this checkpoint, he said. His voice did not waver. Julian, who had been standing with his hands at his sides, turned his head slowly and locked eyes with Lockhart. The disbelief in his expression was total. Lockhart met his gaze and leaned in close enough that Julian could smell the chewing tobacco on his breath. Do not say a word, Lockhart whispered. Not a single word. The radio went quiet for exactly 11 seconds. Julian counted them because counting was what he did when adrenaline hit, when the cockpit shook and the instrument screamed and every nerve in his body wanted to react instead of think. 11 seconds of dead air. Then the aide's voice came back, and this time the tone had shifted from urgent to suspicious. The aide stated clearly that GPS tracking on Kendrick's government-issued vehicle placed him at Hadley County Regional Airfield at that exact moment. The transmission was logged. The coordinates were confirmed. There was nowhere for the lie to hide. Lockhart's jaw tightened. He looked at the radio on his shoulder as if it had betrayed him. And then he did something that told Julian this situation was about to get much worse. Lockhart reached up and switched the radio off entirely. The click of the power button was small, almost inaudible, under the low hum of cicadas in the tree line beyond the fence. But to Julian it sounded like a door slamming shut. He had been in enough volatile situations to recognize the exact moment when a confrontation crossed the line between recoverable and dangerous, and that click was the line. Julian made his decision. He spoke calmly and clearly, projecting his voice, so that Dempsey, who was now standing 6 feet behind Lockhart with his hand resting uncertainly near his belt, could hear every syllable. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Julian Kendrick, United States Air Force Service Number 4, 72-8-1-9364, assigned to Air Force Special Operations Command out of Moody Air Force Base. I am here under direct orders from Brigadier General Raymond Langford to lead a classified operational drill. You are in possession of a destroyed federal document that was issued under the authority of the Department of Defense. He never raised his voice. He never moved his hands. He delivered the statement the way he delivered mission briefs, with total control and absolute clarity. Lockhart's reaction was immediate and physical. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, grabbed Julian by the back of the neck, and slammed him face first against the hood of the patrol car. The metal was hot from sitting in the Georgia sun all afternoon, and Julian felt the heat sear through his pullover and into his chest. Lockhart pressed his forearm across the back of Julian's neck and pushed down. "You do not talk to me like that," Lockhart said through clenched teeth. "I do not care what letters you put in front of your name. Out here I am the law." Dempsey moved forward. "Lockhart," he said quietly, "maybe we should just let this go. Maybe we should call the base and check it out." Lockhart turned his head and fixed Dempsey with a look that stopped the younger deputy in his tracks. "You back off right now," Lockhart said, "or I will write you up for insubordination before your shift is over. Do you understand me?" Dempsey stood still. His mouth opened and then closed. He looked at Julian pinned against the car, and then he looked away. Julian pressed his palms flat against the hot hood and focused on breathing. The weight on his neck was substantial. Lockhart was a large man, at least 6'2", and well over 200 pounds, and he was using every bit of that size to keep Julian immobilized. Julian could have resisted. His training gave him the capability to reverse the hold and put Lockhart on the ground in under 3 seconds. But he also knew exactly what would happen to a black man who put his hands on a white officer in rural Georgia, no matter how justified the action. He stayed still. Lockhart removed one hand just long enough to pull his cell phone from his pocket and dial a number he clearly knew from memory. The call connected almost immediately. "It is Lockhart," he said. "I have got a situation at the airfield. Got a suspicious individual here with forged federal documents trying to access the runway. He is claiming to be military, but the documents are counterfeit. I need you out here." The person on the other end of the line said something brief, and Lockhart hung up. Julian did not know it yet, but the call had gone to Sheriff Dale Overton, who was not only the head of Hadley County law enforcement, but also Brett Lockhart's uncle by marriage. Overton arrived in under 9 minutes, which meant he had either been very close or had driven very fast, or both. He pulled up in an unmarked SUV, stepped out, and walked toward the checkpoint with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who owned every square foot of ground beneath his boots. Overton was in his late 50s, thick through the shoulders with a gray buzz cut and a gold sheriff's badge pinned to a brown leather jacket, despite the heat. He looked at Julian, still pressed against the patrol car, and then at Lockhart. "What have we got?" Overton said. Lockhart recounted his version of events. Suspicious mail, forged credentials, refused to comply with instructions, became verbally aggressive. At no point did he mention the radio transmission from Air Force Special Operations Command. At no point did he mention that GPS tracking had confirmed Julian's presence. Overton listened, nodded once, and looked at Julian. "We have been having problems with individuals faking military credentials to access airfields in this region," Overton said, as if reciting a line he had prepared in advance. "You are going to be detained until we can sort this out." Julian looked Overton directly in the eye and told him everything. His name, his rank, his commanding officer's name and direct line, the nature of his assignment, the destroyed federal pass, the radio transmission Lockhart had lied about and then shut off. Overton's expression did not change by a single degree. "Cuff him," Overton said to Lockhart. Lockhart pulled Julian's arms behind his back and locked the handcuffs tight enough that the metal bit into his wrists. He was placed in the back seat of the patrol car. The door closed. Through the window, as the car pulled out of the airfield access road and turned onto the county highway, Julian saw something that neither Lockhart nor Overton had noticed. A woman was standing just inside the terminal building behind the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the small waiting area. She had her phone raised. She was recording. Her name was Carolyn Strickland, a white civilian who had been waiting for a private charter flight. And she had captured everything. The pass being torn, Julian being slammed against the car, the handcuffs, the sheriff's arrival. By the time Lockhart's patrol car reached the county road, Strickland had uploaded the first clip to 3 different social media platforms. The footage was 47 seconds long, and it was about to change everything. The Hadley County Sheriff's Station sat at the end of a 2-lane road, flanked by overgrown lots and a shuttered gas station with boarded windows. It was a single-story brick building with a flagpole out front and a parking lot that held no more than 12 vehicles. Julian was led through a side entrance past a hallway lined with framed photos of sheriffs going back 5 decades, every single face in those frames, white, and into a processing room that smelled like floor cleaner and stale air. The charges they put on paper were staggering: forgery of federal documents, trespassing on federally adjacent property, impersonation of military personnel. Each one was a felony. Each one carried years in a federal penitentiary. Julian stood at the booking counter while a young deputy, a kid who looked no older than 25, and who had only been on the job for 8 months, took his fingerprints and photographed him from the front and both sides. The young deputy's hands were not steady. He fumbled with the ink pad twice and apologized under his breath each time, though the apology seemed directed less at Julian and more at the air around him, as if he was sorry the situation existed at all, but did not know how to say it to anyone who mattered. Julian did not resist any part of the process. He stood where they told him to stand. He turned when they told him to turn. And throughout every second of it, he recited information. His full service number, his commanding officer's name and direct line at Moody Air Force Base, his military identification number repeated from memory, because the physical card was in his wallet, which Lockhart had confiscated at the airfield. His exact assignment details, including the classification code of the extraction drill he was supposed to be leading at that very moment. He delivered all of it with the calm precision of a man reading coordinates into a cockpit headset while flying through a storm. The booking deputy wrote it all down, but never once picked up a phone to verify any of it. He was following Overton's written instructions, which had been left on the booking desk before Julian even arrived at the station. Do not contact any external agencies until further notice. Process and hold. Julian was allowed 1 phone call. He asked for the phone, and they handed him a corded receiver mounted to the wall beside the holding area entrance. He dialed the number he knew by heart, General Langford's direct line. It rang twice. Langford answered with his rank and last name the way he always did, clipped and expectant. Julian identified himself, and then laid out the situation in under 90 seconds. Detained by Hadley County Sheriff's deputies, charged with forgery, trespassing, and impersonation. Federal flight authorization pass destroyed. Radio transmission from AFSOC lied about and suppressed. Currently at the Hadley County Sheriff's Station in booking. The line went silent. 3 full seconds passed, with nothing but the faint static hum of a secure connection. Julian had served under Langford for 4 years, and in all that time he had never once heard the general go quiet. Langford was a man who filled every silence with decision. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register Julian had only heard once before, during a mission debrief after a helicopter had been shot down in a combat zone with 3 crew members on board. That register was not anger. It was something colder, something that burned slower and lasted longer. "I am going to ask you one question," Langford said, "and I need you to answer it precisely. Are you injured?" Julian paused. His wrists were bruised from the handcuffs. The skin across his chest was tender where Lockhart had pressed him into the hot car hood. A scrape along his left cheekbone from where his face had hit the metal had dried into a thin line of rust-colored blood. "I am uninjured," Sir Julian said. Langford did not respond to that. Instead, he said 4 words. "I am handling this." And he hung up. What happened next unfolded with the kind of velocity that only the United States military can generate when it decides to move. Langford's first call went to Major Nathan Greer, a JAG officer stationed at Moody, who had built a career on dismantling obstruction and civil rights violation cases within and adjacent to the military system. Greer was instructed to get to Hadley County immediately with full federal jurisdiction documentation. 2 agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations were dispatched alongside him. But Langford did not stop there. His second call went to the Pentagon. This was the call that changed the nature of the situation entirely. The extraction drill Julian was supposed to lead was not a routine training exercise. It was tied to an active readiness protocol, a time-sensitive operation linked directly to national defense preparedness in the southeastern United States. 27 military personnel were sitting idle on the tarmac at Hadley County Regional Airfield. 4 helicopters and a mobile command unit were burning fuel and budget with every passing minute. The estimated cost of the delay had already surpassed $300,000 and was climbing. When Langford explained to the Pentagon that the operational lead of a classified readiness drill had been detained by local law enforcement on fabricated charges, the Pentagon did not deliberate. They classified the situation as a potential national security interference. This was no longer a county arrest. It was no longer a civil rights complaint. It was now a federal incident involving the Department of Defense, and every second Julian remained in that holding cell, the situation escalated further up a chain of command that Brett Lockhart and Dale Overton did not even know existed. The video Caroline Strickland uploaded from the airfield terminal hit the internet like a match dropped into a pool of gasoline. Within the first hour, it had been shared over 170,000 times across 3 platforms. By the second hour, major news networks had picked it up, and their digital teams were already cutting it into segments with bold text overlays and caption banners. By the 4th hour, the clip had been viewed more than 6 million times, and Hadley County, Georgia, a place most Americans had never heard of and could not find on a map, was the most talked about location in the country. The footage was devastating in its clarity. Strickland had filmed through clean glass from a distance of no more than 30 feet. The angle captured Lockhart holding the federal flight authorization pass, tearing it in half, the pieces falling, and then the physical confrontation. It showed Lockhart grabbing Julian by the neck and slamming him face first into the patrol car. It showed the handcuffs being applied. It showed Sheriff Overton arriving and standing over Julian with his arms folded while Lockhart secured the restraints. There was no ambiguity. There was no angle from which the footage could be reinterpreted as anything other than what it was. A black man in civilian clothes, calm and compliant, being brutalized and arrested by a white officer who never once attempted to verify his identity. The audio was faint but audible. Viewers could hear Julian identifying himself. They could hear Lockhart telling him to shut his mouth. They could hear the metallic click of the handcuffs. Overton, blindsided by the speed and scale of the public reaction, held a press conference on the courthouse steps at 7:30 that evening. He stood behind a portable podium with the county seal taped to the front, flanked by 2 deputies who stared straight ahead with the rigid posture of men who wished they were anywhere else. Overton spoke for less than 4 minutes. He defended Lockhart. He said his deputy had followed standard operating protocol for handling suspicious individuals attempting to gain unauthorized access to restricted areas. He called the public reaction premature, irresponsible, and driven by a rush to judgment fueled by incomplete information taken out of context. He did not take questions. Inside the county jail, Julian had been moved from the booking area to a general holding cell. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, concrete walls painted a color that might have once been white, but had aged into a dull, uneven gray. A metal bench bolted to the wall served as both seat and bed. The overhead light buzzed with a frequency that bored into the base of his skull. In the adjacent cell, separated by a wall of steel bars, a white detainee who had been watching the news coverage on a small television mounted in the common area recognized Julian the moment he was brought in. The man pressed his face against the bars and began hurling racial slurs with the lazy confidence of someone who believed the walls around him made him untouchable. He called Julian every name that centuries of American hatred had invented, and he did it loudly enough that the duty officer at the end of the hallway could hear every syllable. The duty officer did not intervene. Julian sat on the metal bench. He placed his hands on his knees. He fixed his eyes on the opposite wall and did not blink. He said nothing. Not a word. Not a sound. His silence was not submission. It was the disciplined stillness of a man who understood that every reaction he gave in this place would be used against him, and he refused to provide even one. An hour passed. Then another. Somewhere after 9 o'clock, during a shift change when the hallway was empty, and the only sound was the buzz of the overhead light, Lockhart appeared outside Julian's cell. He was off duty but still in uniform, and the fact that he had come back to the station on his own time said everything about the kind of satisfaction he was drawing from this. Lockhart leaned against the bars with one arm draped over the crossbar and looked at Julian the way a man looks at something he has caught and caged. "You know what your problem is," Lockhart said. "You walked into a place like this thinking you belonged. That is your problem. A black man in street clothes with a piece of plastic he probably printed at home, and he thinks he can walk onto an airfield and nobody is going to say anything." He shook his head and smiled. "Nobody in this county is going to believe you had real federal clearance. Nobody. I have been here 15 years. I know every face that comes through that gate, and I have never seen yours." Julian looked at Lockhart for the first time since the deputy had appeared. He held the eye contact for 5 seconds. Then he looked away back at the wall and said nothing. Lockhart waited as if expecting a response that would justify whatever he wanted to do next. When none came, he pushed off the bars and walked back down the hallway, his boots echoing on the polished concrete until the sound disappeared behind a closing door. 20 minutes later, a vehicle pulled into the sheriff's station parking lot. Major Nathan Greer stepped out flanked by 2 agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Greer was carrying a leather portfolio containing federal jurisdiction papers, a certified copy of Julian's service record, a duplicate of the destroyed Federal Flight Authorization Pass, and an emergency release order signed by the Commanding General of Air Force Special Operations Command. He walked through the front entrance and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. The desk sergeant directed him to Overton's office. Greer knocked once entered and placed the jurisdiction papers on Overton's desk. He stated in clear, unambiguous terms that Lieutenant Colonel Julian Kendrick was a federally commissioned officer who had been detained without cause, that his federal credentials had been destroyed, and that his immediate release was required under federal law. Overton leaned back in his chair and looked at the papers without touching them. He waited a long moment, letting the silence do its work, and then he planted both palms flat on his desk and said the words that would later be quoted in every legal filing, every news segment, and every congressional record entry related to this case. "This man is in my custody on my charges in my county. Federal jurisdiction does not supersede local law enforcement authority in Hadley County. You want him released, you get a federal judge and come back with a court order." Then he called a deputy to escort Greer out of the building. Greer stood up slowly. He closed his portfolio. He looked at Overton the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray that confirms the worst possible diagnosis. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," Greer said, "and it will end your career." Then he turned and walked out. The standoff between Hadley County and the federal government exploded into public view within hours of Greer's removal from the sheriff's station. Greer, a man who did not waste time and did not bluff, was on the phone before he reached his vehicle in the parking lot. He contacted the federal court system's emergency filing division for the Southern District of Georgia and requested an immediate audience with a sitting judge who had jurisdiction over civil rights violations and federal officer detentions. The call was routed through 2 clerks and a duty magistrate before it landed on the desk of Federal Judge Solomon Meacham, a man whose reputation in the Southern District was built on two things: an exhaustive knowledge of constitutional law and an absolute intolerance for local officials who believed their authority existed outside the reach of federal oversight. Meacham reviewed the filing in under 40 minutes and began drafting orders. While Greer worked the legal channels, the streets around the Hadley County Courthouse began to change. The first protesters arrived before sunset, a small group of 12 or 15 people from the neighboring towns who had seen the video online and driven over. By the time full darkness settled over the courthouse square, the group had swelled to more than 200. They carried handmade signs. They chanted Julian's name and demanded his release. Candles appeared, held in cupped hands that glowed in the warm Georgia night. Within hours, the national response intensified. Civil rights organizations issued formal statements condemning the detention. Prominent attorneys offered pro bono representation. Community leaders from across the state called for an independent investigation into Hadley County law enforcement. The pressure was enormous and increasing with every news cycle, every social media share, every new voice that added itself to the chorus outside the courthouse, 38 miles away. At the house on the base-adjacent residential street where Julian and Simone Kendrick had lived for the past 3 years, Simone was grading papers at the dining room table when her phone lit up with a text from a colleague. The text contained a link. Simone opened it and watched the video once. Then she watched it again. Then she set the phone down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface and breathed. She recognized Julian's gray pullover. She recognized the way he stood, the set of his shoulders, the way he kept his hands visible, and his posture open and non-threatening, all the things he had taught himself to do over decades of existing in a country that treated his body as a threat before it treated him as a person. She watched the deputy grab her husband by the neck. She watched him get slammed into the car. She watched the handcuffs close around his wrists. Simone stood up from the table. She picked up her keys. She walked out the front door and got into their second car, a blue sedan, that still had Julian's spare uniform hanging from the hook behind the driver's seat in a dry cleaning bag. She drove 1 hour and 20 minutes to Hadley County. She did not call ahead. She did not contact a lawyer. She did not call Langford's office or Greer or anyone else. She drove because her husband was in a cell, and nothing else in the world was going to keep her from standing as close to him as they would let her. She arrived at the sheriff's station at 11:14 at night. The building was lit from inside by fluorescent tubes that cast a blue-white glow through the front windows. 2 patrol cars sat in the parking lot. A single deputy stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the street. Simone walked past him and through the front door. The desk area was quiet. A counter separated the public lobby from the administrative area behind it. Standing behind that counter, filling out a form with a pen that he clicked repeatedly against the surface, was Brett Lockhart. He looked up when Simone entered, and something crossed his face, a momentary calculation, the kind of rapid assessment a predator makes when new movement enters its field of vision. Simone told him who she was. She told him she was there to see her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Julian Kendrick, who was being unlawfully held in this facility. Her voice was steady, but the tendons in her neck were taut and visible, and her hands were clenched at her sides. Lockhart looked at the clock on the wall behind him, and then back at Simone. "Visiting hours ended at 3 o'clock, he said. "You will have to come back tomorrow." Simone did not move. She stood at that counter and told Lockhart she was not leaving until she saw her husband. Lockhart leaned forward on the counter and told her that if she did not vacate the building within the next 60 seconds, he would arrest her for loitering and obstruction. Simone stood exactly where she was. Her breathing changed, became faster, shallower, and her eyes glistened under the fluorescent light. But she did not cry, and she did not move. She told Lockhart to do whatever he felt he needed to do, because she was not going anywhere. Down the hallway, through 2 sets of locked doors, and past the booking area, Julian heard her voice. He could not make out the words, but he did not need to. He knew her voice the way he knew the sound of his own rotors at altitude, a frequency that registered in his chest before it reached his ears. For the first time since the ordeal began, Julian's composure fractured. His jaw tightened until the muscles along his temples stood out like cables under the skin. His hands gripped the edge of the metal bench so hard his knuckles went pale. He closed his eyes and focused on breathing the way he had been trained, 4 counts in hold for 4 counts out. But this was not a combat scenario. This was not a mechanical failure or a hostile landing zone. This was his wife standing in the lobby of a building run by men who had already demonstrated what they were willing to do to people who looked like her, and he could not reach her. He could not protect her. He could not even see her. That was the cruelest part of all of it. Not the handcuffs, not the cell, not the charges or the torn pass or the slurs from the adjacent cell. It was hearing Simone's voice and knowing he could do nothing. At 11:41 that night, Judge Solomon Meacham issued 2 orders. The first was an emergency release order, mandating the immediate release of Lieutenant Colonel Julian Kendrick from Hadley County custody. The second was a temporary restraining order barring all Hadley County law enforcement personnel from any further detention, questioning, or contact with Julian Kendrick. Both orders were served electronically to the sheriff's station and hand-delivered by a U.S. Marshal who arrived 30 minutes later. Overton received the orders. He read them slowly, then set them on his desk, and informed the Marshal that processing the release would take time due to administrative procedures. The Marshal told him the order was effective immediately. Overton said he understood, but that the paperwork needed to be completed properly, and that rushing it would create liability issues for the county. It was a stall, naked and deliberate, and everyone in the building knew it. During this manufactured delay, while the U.S. Marshal waited in the lobby, and Simone stood against the far wall with her arms wrapped around herself, Brett Lockhart slipped away from the front desk. He walked down a back corridor, used his keycard to access the evidence storage room, and opened the locker containing Julian's personal effects. He reached into his own jacket pocket and removed a small sealed plastic bag containing a white powdery substance. He placed it inside the box alongside Julian's wallet, keys, and phone. Then he closed the locker and walked back to the front desk. What Lockhart did not know, what he could not have known, because the installation had been done covertly by trained professionals, while the station's attention was consumed by the protests and the media and the federal court orders, was that the AFOSI agents who had accompanied Greer had anticipated precisely this kind of retaliation. Before leaving the station, they had placed miniature surveillance cameras in the station's main corridors and in the evidence storage room itself. Every second of Lockhart's visit to that locker was recorded. His face, his hands, the bag, the placement, the timestamp. All of it captured in high-definition video that was already being transmitted to a secure server at Moody Air Force Base. The AFOSI agents reviewed the surveillance footage at 12:17 in the morning, 36 minutes after Lockhart planted the evidence. The senior agent, a 15-year veteran who had investigated everything from espionage to assault within the military justice system, watched the recording twice without speaking. Then he picked up a secure phone and called General Langford directly. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, the nature of the case against Brett Lockhart had transformed entirely. What had begun as a civil rights violation and wrongful detention was now a constellation of federal felonies: evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to deprive a citizen of their civil rights under color of law, fabrication of criminal charges against a federally commissioned officer. Each charge carried its own mandatory minimum sentence and combined they represented the kind of legal exposure that could put a man behind bars for decades. The footage was preserved under chain of custody protocols and flagged for immediate use in any proceeding. Julian's release finally occurred at 1:22 in the morning, nearly 9 hours after he had first been handcuffed at the airfield. The administrative delay Overton had manufactured bought Lockhart just enough time to plant the evidence, which was exactly what Overton had intended, though he would deny that coordination under oath for months to come. Julian walked out of the station through the same side entrance they had brought him in through. The night air hit his face warm and thick with the scent of pine and asphalt. The fluorescent light from the building behind him cast his shadow long and thin across the parking lot. Simone was standing on the sidewalk behind a metal barricade that deputies had set up to keep civilians away from the building entrance. When she saw him come through the door, she made a sound that was not a word. It was something older than language, something that came from a place in the body that words cannot reach. She pushed past the barricade and ran. Julian caught her. His arms closed around her, and he held on with the grip of a man who has just been pulled from deep water. She pressed her face into his chest, and he pressed his face into her hair, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Every news camera present captured the embrace. The protest crowd, which had maintained a vigil on the courthouse square throughout the night, erupted when word of his release reached them. The image of Julian and Simone holding each other framed by the barricade and the protest signs and the glow of the sheriff's station behind them was broadcast on every major network before sunrise. It became the defining image of the story. But Julian's freedom came with a wound that no embrace could heal. Major Greer was waiting beside his vehicle in the far corner of the parking lot. He approached Julian after Simone released him and delivered the news in the direct, unvarnished manner that Julian had come to expect from him. The classified extraction drill had been officially scrapped. The delay caused by Julian's detention had made the operation untimely. The 27 personnel had been recalled. The 4 helicopters had been returned to Moody. The mobile command unit had been packed up and driven back to base. The total cost to the Air Force now exceeded $1.2 million, and the readiness gap created by the canceled drill would take months to close. Julian absorbed the information in silence. He nodded once, slowly. He did not argue or express frustration, or ask why they could not simply reschedule. He understood with the clarity of a man who has spent his entire career inside systems designed by people who did not always account for the obstacles placed specifically in front of people who looked like him, that this cost would be measured in more than dollars. Careers would be scrutinized. Readiness reports would reflect the gap. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone would quietly note that the delay was connected to Lieutenant Colonel Kendrick, and the color of his skin would become an unspoken variable in every evaluation that followed. He had done everything right, every single thing. He followed orders. He dressed as instructed. He presented the correct documentation. He remained calm under provocation. He did not resist. He identified himself clearly and repeatedly, and none of it mattered because one man could not see past the color of his skin. The Pentagon formally announced an investigation into the Hadley County Sheriff's Department the following morning. The announcement cited obstruction of military operations and systemic civil rights violations as the primary areas of inquiry. Federal investigators from multiple agencies were assigned to the case. The announcement made national headlines, but in Hadley County itself, the response was not surrender. It was counterattack. Lockhart, facing mounting pressure and the reality that the video evidence was unambiguous, launched a counteroffensive through local media. Within 48 hours of Julian's release, Lockhart produced a witness. Gerald Fenwick was the civilian manager of Hadley County Regional Airfield, a thin, nervous man in his 50s who had overseen the facility for 11 years, and who owed his position to a county contract that was renewed annually at the discretion of the sheriff's office. Fenwick appeared on a local television station and gave a recorded statement. His account was detailed and delivered with the rehearsed cadence of someone who had practiced it many times before saying it on camera. Fenwick claimed that Julian had been acting erratically when he arrived at the airfield. He said Julian's behavior was aggressive and confrontational from the moment he approached the checkpoint. He said the federal flight authorization pass appeared physically altered with visible signs of tampering along the edges and inconsistencies in the lamination. And he said that he, Gerald Fenwick, had personally called the sheriff's office out of concern for the safety of the airfield and its personnel. The statement was specific enough to sound credible to anyone who had not watched the video carefully. Local news ran it extensively. A segment of the Hadley County community rallied behind Lockhart, framing him as a dedicated officer who had been doing his job and was now being persecuted by outside forces with a political agenda. Online, the narrative split. The national conversation, which had been nearly unanimous in its condemnation of Lockhart, suddenly developed a secondary current of doubt. Julian's clear-cut case looked muddied. And that was exactly what Lockhart wanted. The split in public opinion hit Julian from a direction he had not prepared for. He had expected the legal fight. He had expected the institutional resistance from Hadley County. He had even expected the personal hostility from Lockhart and Overton. What he had not expected was the sensation of watching half the country debate whether he deserved what happened to him. Fenwick's testimony gave Lockhart's defenders a foothold, and they used it aggressively. A local political action group with documented financial ties to Overton's re-election campaigns launched a Back the Badge initiative centered specifically on Lockhart. They set up a fundraising page that collected over $40,000 in its first week. They printed yard signs that appeared on lawns throughout Hadley County and the surrounding towns. They organized a rally on the courthouse steps, where speakers described Lockhart as a patriot who was being sacrificed to satisfy the demands of a media mob. The campaign was polished and coordinated in a way that suggested professional involvement, and its effect was to transform Lockhart from a deputy under investigation into a symbol of resistance against federal overreach. The hostility became personal almost immediately. Julian and Simone began receiving phone calls at their home. The calls came at all hours. Some were silent. Others carried threats spoken in low, controlled voices that made the words land harder than any shout ever could. A letter was found on the windshield of Simone's car in the parking lot of the high school, where she served as principal. The paper was plain white, folded once, and when she opened it, the single word written in the center in black marker made her hands shake so violently that she dropped the letter on the ground and had to steady herself against the car door before she could pick it up again. She did not show Julian the letter. She put it in a plastic bag and gave it to Greer, who passed it to the AFOSI agents. Their children were pulled from extracurricular activities by other parents who did not want to be associated with the controversy. Playdates were canceled. Birthday party invitations stopped arriving. Julian's 12-year-old son came home from school one afternoon and asked his father a question that landed like a physical blow. He asked whether they had done something wrong. Greer counseled Julian to stay silent. Avoid media appearances. Do not give interviews or make public statements. Let the investigation proceed through proper channels and trust the process. Julian sat with that counsel the way he sat with turbulence, holding steady while everything around him shook. But the silence was excruciating. It felt like cooperation with his own erasure. He had spent his entire career following orders from systems that did not always protect people who looked like him. And now the system was asking him to be quiet, while the man who had assaulted him and planted evidence against him was being celebrated as a hero on the courthouse steps of a county that had tried to put him in prison. He held the line. But the line held him too in a grip that tightened every day. The Afosi investigation, meanwhile, had been expanding in scope since the moment the surveillance footage of the evidence planting was secured. Agents spent weeks conducting interviews, pulling records, and tracing Lockhart's career through the Hadley County Sheriff's Department. What they found was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern so consistent and so sustained that it could only be described as systemic. Over the past 12 years, Brett Lockhart had detained, harassed, or filed false reports against more than 40 black individuals at various checkpoints, traffic stops, and routine encounters throughout Hadley County. The methods varied, but the pattern was identical. Pretextual stops based on vague suspicions, prolonged detentions without cause, confiscation or destruction of personal property, verbal abuse including racial slurs documented by multiple witnesses, fabricated charges that were later quietly dismissed when no evidence materialized. And in every single case, complaints filed against Lockhart were dismissed, buried, or rerouted by Overton's office before they reached any external review body. 40 cases spanning 12 years, and not one had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Investigative journalist Audrey Reese had been covering the story from the first hour the video went public. Reese worked for a national news outlet with a reputation for long-form investigative reporting, and she had the resources and the tenacity to do what official channels often could not. She independently tracked down 19 of Lockhart's previous victims. She interviewed each one on camera. Their stories were remarkably, devastatingly consistent. A black man pulled over for a broken taillight that was not broken. A black woman detained at a gas station because her license plate supposedly did not match the vehicle, even though it did. A black teenager held for 4 hours at a checkpoint because his school identification card looked suspicious. Every one of them described the same sequence: the stop, the escalation, the slurs, the charges, the complaints that went nowhere. And every one of them described the same feeling afterward, the suffocating certainty that there was no point in fighting back because the system that was supposed to hold Lockhart accountable was the same system that employed him, promoted him, and protected him. Reese compiled everything into a devastating long-form expose that ran across the front page of a major national news outlet. The article named Lockhart. It named Overton. It named the systemic rot that had allowed one man's hatred to operate unchecked for over a decade inside a department that answered only to itself. Within 24 hours of publication, Gerald Fenwick contacted Reese directly. He was terrified. His voice on the phone was thin and unsteady, and he spoke quickly as if afraid he would lose his nerve if he paused. He recanted his entire statement. He told Reese that every word of his televised account was fabricated. Julian Kendrick had not been erratic. The federal flight authorization pass had not appeared altered. Fenwick had not called the sheriff's office out of concern. He had been coerced. Lockhart had personally visited Fenwick at his home, sat in his living room, and told him in precise terms what he would say on camera. When Fenwick hesitated, Lockhart told him that his county contract was up for renewal in 2 months, and that Overton could make that renewal disappear with a single phone call. He told Fenwick that his wife worked part-time at the county clerk's office, and that positions there were also subject to review. Fenwick folded. But he had done something that Lockhart did not know about. Before giving the televised statement, Fenwick had activated the voice recording application on his phone and placed it in his shirt pocket during 2 separate phone calls with Lockhart. The recordings captured Lockhart explicitly coaching Fenwick on what to say, correcting his phrasing and threatening consequences if he refused or deviated from the script. Fenwick turned the recordings over to Reese. They were authenticated by an independent audio forensics lab and published alongside the expose. The case against Lockhart was now airtight from every conceivable angle. The video, the Afosi surveillance footage, the pattern of 40 victims, the coerced testimony, the recorded phone calls. There was no defense left. But that same evening, as Julian sat in his living room reading the article on his laptop with Simone beside him, a notification appeared in his military email. New orders from Air Force Personnel Command, effective in 14 days. Reassignment to a desk position at a logistics support office in Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. The transfer was technically a lateral move. Same rank, same pay grade, no formal demotion. But Julian and Simone both stared at the screen and understood exactly what it was. Someone above Langford's level, someone with enough authority to issue personnel orders without Langford's approval, wanted Julian out of Georgia and out of the spotlight. The system was trying to make the whole thing disappear. And Julian Kendrick, the man who had done everything right, was being asked to disappear with it. Julian sat at the kitchen table with the transfer orders printed on a single sheet of paper in front of him. Simone sat across the table. Between them, 2 cups of coffee grew cold. Neither of them had spoken in almost 15 minutes. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. The orders were written in the bland, bureaucratic language that the military uses when it wants something significant to look routine. Reassignment, logistics support, Offutt Air Force Base. Report date in 14 days. No explanation given beyond standard operational needs of the service. Julian had spent 18 years learning to read what the military said between the lines, and what these orders said between the lines was unmistakable. Nebraska was a burial. A logistics desk at Offutt was where they sent officers whose presence had become inconvenient. He would spend his remaining years of service processing supply requisitions and equipment transfers in a windowless office on a base where nobody would remember to ask why a decorated combat rescue pilot was stamping forms instead of flying missions. His career would not end. It would evaporate, and the story would evaporate with it. Lockhart's trial would proceed in some quiet courtroom while the news cycle moved on to the next outrage. The systemic rot in Hadley County would be noted in a report that would sit in a filing cabinet until someone needed the shelf space, and Julian would become a footnote, a name people vaguely remembered from a video they watched once, and then forgot. Simone broke the silence first. She did not ask him what he was going to do. She did not tell him what she thought he should do. She said 5 words. "You did not earn this." Julian looked at her across the table. The light from the kitchen window fell across her face, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the accumulated weight of weeks of threats and isolation and fear, and beneath all of it, the unshakable steel that had made him fall in love with her the first time he heard her speak. She was right. He had not earned this transfer. He had earned his rank. He had earned his position. He had earned every flight hour and every commendation and every operational lead assignment through a career of excellence that left no room for the arguments people made behind closed doors about officers who looked like him. And he was not going to let them take it by making him disappear. Julian made his decision that night. The next morning he contacted the office of the congresswoman from Georgia who sat on the House Armed Services Committee. Through Greer's legal connections and the institutional relationships that Langford had quietly maintained even after being overridden on the transfer orders, Julian requested the opportunity to testify before a congressional subcommittee that had recently been convened to examine racial discrimination in law enforcement interactions with military personnel. The request moved through channels faster than Julian expected. The subcommittee chair recognized the case immediately because, like the rest of the country, she had seen the video. The hearing was scheduled within 10 days. Julian prepared with the meticulousness that defined every aspect of his professional life. He did not write a speech. He organized his experiences. He went through his entire career, 18 years of service across 3 combat theaters and more than a dozen domestic assignments, and he catalogued every instance in which the color of his skin had been treated as more relevant than the uniform he wore. The first incident was in his second year of service, when he was pulled over in full-dress uniform while driving to a formal event on base, and the officer who stopped him asked whose car he was driving. Not where he was going. Not could he see his license. Whose car are you driving? As if the only explanation for a black man in an officer's uniform driving a decent vehicle was theft. The second incident came 3 years later, when a base military police officer refused to salute him as he passed through a security checkpoint. When Julian stopped and identified himself, the MP stared at his rank insignia and said he would need to verify the uniform with the personnel office because he had concerns about its authenticity. The third incident, the fourth, the seventh, the 12th, each one documented, each one absorbed, each one a small, precise cut that individually might have been dismissed as a misunderstanding or an overreaction, but collectively formed a pattern so clear and so relentless that it could not be called anything other than what it was. Julian testified on a Tuesday morning in Washington. He wore his full-dress uniform, with every decoration he had earned arranged precisely according to regulation. He sat behind a microphone at a long table facing the subcommittee members, and he delivered his statement without notes. He spoke for 42 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not express anger or bitterness or self-pity. He laid out the facts of his career, the facts of the Hadley County incident, and the facts of every encounter in between with the same controlled precision he used to navigate a helicopter through hostile airspace. He described the pass being torn. He described being slammed into the car. He described the holding cell and the slurs and the planted evidence and his wife standing in the lobby being threatened with arrest. He described the transfer orders. And then he said something that silenced the entire hearing room. He said that the most dangerous moment of his military career was not in any combat zone he had flown in. It was standing at a checkpoint in his own country in civilian clothes, holding valid federal documentation, and realizing that none of it would protect him, because the man with the authority to let him pass had already decided before a single word was exchanged that a black man did not belong on the other side of that gate. The hearing room was silent. Multiple committee members were visibly struggling to maintain composure. One member removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her closed eyes. Another looked down at the table and did not look up again for nearly a minute. Then the question and answer portion began, and the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. A senior congressman, the ranking member of the subcommittee, revealed information that had been declassified specifically for this hearing. The extraction drill Julian had been ordered to lead on the day of his detention was not a routine training exercise. It was a critical readiness test for a rapid response protocol designated for the protection of senior government officials in the event of an airborne emergency in the southeastern United States. The protocol was tied directly to an active national defense directive, and its successful execution was considered essential to maintaining operational readiness at the highest levels. By detaining Julian Kendrick and causing the drill to be scrapped, Lockhart's actions had not merely violated one man's civil rights. They had created a verified gap in national security readiness that took the Department of Defense 11 weeks to close. 11 weeks during which the rapid response capability for the southeastern United States operated below its required threshold. The revelation transformed the case entirely. It was no longer possible for anyone at any level to quietly transfer Julian to a desk in Nebraska and let Hadley County handle things through local proceedings. This was a documented national security compromise caused by racial discrimination. The transfer orders were rescinded that same afternoon. The reckoning that came for Hadley County arrived with a weight that no one in that courthouse, that sheriff's station, or that airfield checkpoint ever anticipated. Federal charges were filed against Brett Lockhart in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Georgia. The indictment listed 5 counts: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, filing false police reports, obstruction of a federal officer in the performance of duty, obstruction of a military operation essential to national defense. The charges collectively carried a maximum sentence of 45 years in federal prison. Lockhart was arrested at his home at 6 a.m. by U.S. Marshals, who woke him with a knock that he later described to his attorney as the loudest sound he had ever heard. Sheriff Dale Overton did not survive the fallout. A state investigation, conducted in parallel with the federal case and corroborated by FOSI findings, and Audrey Reese's reporting revealed a pattern of systematic suppression of civil rights complaints spanning more than a decade. The governor of Georgia removed Overton from office by executive order. Overton was subsequently indicted on charges of conspiracy official misconduct and willful suppression of evidence related to civil rights violations. His attorney filed motions to dismiss every charge. Every motion was denied. Cody Dempsey, the young deputy who had stood behind Lockhart at the airfield and said nothing while Julian was slammed against the car and handcuffed, cooperated fully with federal investigators. His testimony filled in the gaps that surveillance footage and victim interviews could not. He described the culture inside the department, the unspoken rules about which complaints to ignore and which detentions to look away from, the understanding that Overton's protection extended only to those who maintained his version of order. In exchange for his cooperation, Dempsey received immunity from prosecution. He resigned from law enforcement permanently. In a recorded interview with Reese, he said that standing behind Lockhart that day and saying nothing was the worst thing he had ever done, and that the silence would follow him for the rest of his life. Julian's transfer was not merely rescinded, it was replaced. The promotion board, acting on a recommendation that carried the weight of both Air Force Special Operations Command and the Congressional Subcommittee's formal findings, elevated Julian to the rank of full colonel. The ceremony took place at Moody Air Force Base, with General Langford presiding. Simone pinned the Eagle insignia to his shoulder. Julian saluted Langford. Langford returned the salute, and then in a departure from protocol that surprised everyone present extended his hand. Julian shook it. Neither man said a word. None were needed. The trial took place over 9 days in federal court in Savannah. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity every day. Julian was called as the primary witness on the 4th day. He sat in the witness chair in full dress uniform and delivered the same steady, precise account he had given to Congress. His voice did not waver. His eyes did not drop. And throughout his entire testimony, Brett Lockhart sat at the defense table 15 feet away, forced to listen to every word spoken by the man he had tried to destroy. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Lockhart was convicted on all 5 counts. At sentencing, the judge delivered a statement that was reprinted in legal journals and cited in law school classrooms for years afterward. She spoke about the compounding nature of unchecked prejudice. She spoke about what happens when hatred is not merely tolerated, but institutionally protected. She spoke about how one man's bigotry, shielded by a corrupt system for over a decade, had nearly compromised the safety of an entire region of the country. And then she imposed the sentence. 3 months after the trial ended, on a morning in early October, when the Georgia heat had finally loosened its grip, and the air smelled like pine and cooling earth, Julian Kendrick drove back to Hadley County Regional Airfield. He was not there to revisit the past. He was there because the United States Air Force, acting on the direct recommendation of the congressional subcommittee that had heard his testimony, had selected this airfield as the permanent site of a new Joint Civil-Military Emergency Response Training Center. The facility would serve as a hub for coordinated readiness drills between military and civilian agencies across the southeastern United States. It was the institutional answer to the gap that Lockhart's actions had exposed, a permanent infrastructure built from the wreckage of what one man's hatred had tried to destroy. and Colonel Julian Kendrick had been appointed as its first commanding officer. Julian stepped out of his vehicle onto the same tarmac where he had been handcuffed. He was in full dress uniform. The morning sun caught the eagle insignia on his shoulder and the rows of ribbons on his chest. The same gate where Lockhart had torn his pass was now flanked by an honor guard standing at attention. Simone stood beside him, her hand resting in the bend of his elbow. Behind them, a formation of airmen, men and women of every race, stood in precise rows, their faces forward, their bearing immaculate. Julian looked down at the asphalt beneath his boots. He found the exact spot where the two halves of his federal flight authorization pass had landed that afternoon. He had memorized the location the way pilots memorize coordinates with precision that does not fade. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the pass. It had been reassembled and laminated, but the tear line was still visible running down the center of the card, like a scar that refused to disappear. He did not hide it. He held the pass up briefly, and then placed it back over his heart. A helicopter roared overhead, its rotors cutting through the Georgia sky as it began the first official drill of the new center. Julian watched it rise. He tracked its ascent the way he had tracked 1,000 ascents before, with the practiced eye of a man who understood flight not just as physics, but as an act of defiance against everything that tries to keep a person on the ground. The Hadley County Regional Airfield sign still stood at the entrance of the facility. It had been there for decades, weathered and faded. But beneath it, mounted on polished steel posts that caught the morning light, a new sign had been installed. It read, Colonel Julian Kendrick Joint Response Training Center. His name, permanent, unerasable, fixed to the very place that tried to erase him. And here is what this story leaves us with. A man stood at a gate. He presented his credentials. Those credentials were destroyed, not because they were invalid, but because the man holding them was black. And from that act of destruction, something was built that will stand long after the hatred that tried to tear it down has been forgotten. So let me ask you this. Have you ever had your right to be somewhere questioned, not because of what you did, but because of who you are? Drop your answer in the comments, because this conversation matters, and every voice that speaks up makes the silence harder to maintain. If this story moved something inside, you leave a like so it reaches someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that needs to be told. And share this video with someone you care about, because stories like Julian's do not change anything if they stay in one place. They only matter when they move. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for refusing to look away. Until next time, carry this with you. The places that try to deny us are the same places where our names belong the most.